Hello, and welcome to the Sleep Library, where history whispers its stories in the gentlest voice. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Whether you're settling into bed, curled up in a cozy corner, or simply seeking a peaceful moment in your day, you've come to the right place. This is our quiet sanctuary where the past comes alive through slow, calming narratives designed to ease your mind and help you drift into restful sleep. Tonight, we'll journey together through forgotten worlds and meet the people whose patient hands created beauty that has lasted for centuries. Before we begin, I'd love to invite you to become part of our growing community. If these gentle historical tales bring you comfort, please consider subscribing. It helps us reach others who might need this same peaceful refuge. And if tonight's story resonates with you, a quiet like would mean the world. I'm always curious about our listeners. Where are you joining us from tonight? Are you listening from your bedroom? Perhaps while rain patters against your window? Or maybe you're traveling, finding comfort in a familiar voice in an unfamiliar place. And when do you usually visit us? Is this part of your evening routine? Or do you find these stories helpful during afternoon quiet moments? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories about where and when you listen help create the warm, connected community that makes the Sleep Library so special. Now, let's dim the lights, settle in comfortably, and let tonight's gentle tale begin. Welcome to the Sleep Library. Tonight, we journey into a world where time moved differently than it does today. A world where the rhythm of life was marked not by digital displays or mechanical ticking, but by the gentle tolling of bronze bells carried on medieval winds. This is the story of how our ancestors measured their days, marked their prayers, and organized their communities through the ancient art of timekeeping. In the centuries we call medieval, roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, time was not the precise, standardized concept we know today. Instead, it flowed like honey, thick and variable, shaped by the seasons, the sun, and the sacred. The measurement of time was an art as much as a science, practiced by monks in stone towers, craftsmen in busy workshops, and bell ringers whose calls echoed across sleeping villages. Tonight, we will explore this unhurried world together. We will walk through monastery courtyards where sundials cast their slow-moving shadows. We will climb bell towers where rope pullers marked the hours with bronze voices that sang across the countryside. We will sit beside medieval clockmakers as they carefully filed gear teeth by candlelight, creating the first mechanical heartbeats that would eventually govern our modern world. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift back to a time when hours stretched like cathedral shadows, when minutes were measured in prayers rather than seconds, and when the gentle sound of church bells was the most reliable timekeeper most people would ever know. Before we can understand the revolution that medieval timekeeping represented, we must first step into a world almost unimaginable to our modern minds, a world without clocks. Imagine, if you will, waking each morning not to the sharp insistence of an alarm, but to the gradual lightening of the sky through a small window. Your day begins not at a specific hour, but when your body naturally stirs, when the cockerel crows, when the light becomes sufficient for work. This was the reality for most of medieval Europe. Time, in the way we understand it today, simply did not exist for the common people. There were no hourly schedules to keep, no precise appointments to make, no rushing to catch a specific departure time. Life moved to different rhythms entirely: the rhythm of the sun's path across the sky, the rhythm of the seasons turning, the rhythm of human needs and natural cycles. In the centuries following the fall of Rome, roughly from 500 to 1000 CE, most of Europe lived in what historians sometimes called the timeless period. This doesn't mean people were unaware of time's passage, but rather that their relationship with time was fluid, approximate, and deeply connected to the natural world around them. A farmer would begin his work when the dew had lifted sufficiently from the fields. A merchant would open her shop when enough people were stirring in the marketplace. A mother would call her children in for supper when the shadows grew long enough to swallow the yard. The day was divided not into hours, but into broad periods that had names rooted in necessity and observation. There was morning, when the world stirred to life. There was midday, when the sun stood highest and work paused for rest and food. There was evening, when tasks wound down and families gathered. And there was night, when most activity ceased and the world surrendered to darkness and sleep. Within these broad divisions, time was marked by natural signs that everyone could read. The position of the sun told you roughly how much daylight remained for outdoor work. The behavior of animals, birds returning to roost, cows gathering at the gate indicated the approach of evening. The changing angle of shadows cast by trees, buildings, or standing stones provided a rough guide to the day's progress. Seasons, too, were marked not by calendar dates, but by natural phenomena. Spring arrived not on a specific day in March, but when certain flowers bloomed, when birds returned from their winter journeys, when farmers judged the soil ready for planting. Summer was measured not in months, but in the length of days, the ripening of crops, the thickness of leaves on trees. Autumn announced itself through the changing colors of foliage, the behavior of animals preparing for winter, the timing of harvest festivals. Winter came not on December 21st, but when the cold settled in to stay, when daylight became truly scarce, when communities turned inward to wait for spring's return. This natural timekeeping had its own profound wisdom. People lived in harmony with their environment in ways that our precisely scheduled world has largely forgotten. They slept more in winter when darkness came early, and rose earlier in summer when dawn broke before what we would now call 5 o'clock. Their work rhythms followed the optimal times for various activities. Grain was harvested when perfectly ripe, not according to a predetermined schedule. Animals were bred when natural cycles indicated the best chances for healthy offspring. Communities organized themselves around shared natural markers. Festivals and markets were held at times determined by agricultural cycles after harvest, before planting, when certain foods were in season. Religious observances followed the natural calendar too, with many Christian holidays deliberately placed to coincide with pre-existing seasonal celebrations that honored the Earth's rhythms. But this natural approach to time had its limitations, especially as medieval society began to grow more complex. Trade between distant regions required some coordination of timing. Religious communities needed to organize their prayers and services. Legal matters sometimes required testimony about when specific events had occurred. The need for more precise, shareable ways of marking time gradually became apparent, particularly within the walls of monasteries, where the rhythm of prayer demanded greater precision than the casual observation of shadows could provide. It was in these religious communities that the first steps toward medieval timekeeping would emerge. Monks, bound by rules that required them to pray at specific intervals throughout the day and night, could not rely solely on natural signs to organize their spiritual practice. They needed ways to measure time that worked in darkness, through cloudy weather, and with enough precision to coordinate the activities of dozens or even hundreds of community members. As we'll see in our next chapter, these early monastic communities would become the laboratories where medieval timekeeping was born, where the first attempts to divide the day into measurable, repeatable units would gradually evolve into the sophisticated systems that would eventually govern all of medieval life. The bells that would come to mark the hours across Europe first rang to call monks to prayer, their bronze voices cutting through the timeless world to impose a new kind of order, not the harsh precision of our modern clocks, but a gentler rhythm that honored both human needs and divine commandments. The soft grey light of dawn filters through narrow stone windows as we enter a medieval monastery in the heart of France, perhaps in the year 800. The building is quiet, but it is not empty. Throughout the complex, monks are stirring, not because an alarm has sounded, but because years of practice have trained their bodies to wake naturally at the proper time. Soon, A single bell will ring across the stone corridors, calling the community to the first prayer service of the day. This bell, and others like it ringing across medieval Europe, would become the foundation upon which all medieval timekeeping was built. The story of medieval time begins with monasticism, that remarkable movement that drew thousands of men and women into communities dedicated to prayer, work, and spiritual contemplation. These communities, following rules established by leaders like Saint Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century, organized their days around a precise schedule of prayer services called the Divine Office, or canonical hours. Unlike the fluid, natural time of the outside world, monastic life demanded precision, regularity, and coordination among many people. Saint Benedict's rule, written around 530 CE, established a framework that would influence timekeeping for centuries to come. The rule divided each day into 8 periods of prayer: matins before dawn, lauds at dawn, prime early morning, terce mid-morning, sext noon, none mid-afternoon, vespers evening, and compline before sleep. Each of these services needed to occur at the proper time, requiring monks to have some reliable way of knowing when to gather in the chapel. Initially, this timing responsibility fell to specific individuals within each monastery. The cantor or a designated timekeeper would observe natural signs, the position of stars before dawn, the angle of shadows during the day, the behavior of animals, and then ring a bell to summon the community to prayer. This was a weighty responsibility, for if the timekeeper failed in his duties, the entire community's spiritual rhythm would be disrupted. The bells themselves were sacred objects, crafted with great care and ceremony. Medieval bell making was a specialized art that combined metallurgy, acoustics, and spiritual significance. The process began with the creation of a clay mold, shaped to produce the desired tone and volume. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was heated in furnaces until it glowed like liquid sunlight, then poured into these molds with prayers and blessings. The calling process could take days, during which the bell makers maintained careful vigil, for any crack or flaw would ruin months of work. When a new bell was completed, it underwent a ceremony called blessing or baptism. The bell was washed with holy water, anointed with sacred oils, and given a name, often that of a saint who would serve as its patron. Inscriptions were frequently cast into the bronze during creation, bearing Latin phrases that spoke of the bell's purpose. I call the living, I mourn the dead, I break the lightning. Read one common inscription, while others bore the names of saints, biblical verses, or the date of the bell's creation. The installation of bells in monastery towers was itself a significant event. These bronze voices, some weighing hundreds or even thousands of pounds, had to be raised by human power alone, using systems of ropes, pulleys, and wooden scaffolding. Once in place, suspended from massive wooden beams in the bell tower, they became the voice of the monastery, capable of being heard for miles across the surrounding countryside. The act of ringing these bells developed its own rituals and techniques. Different prayers required different patterns of ringing. A single toll might announce the death of a community member, while a series of measured strikes would call the monks to prayer. The ringer, often a younger monk assigned to this duty, learned to read time not from any mechanical device, but from careful observation of natural signs, then translate that knowledge into the bronze language that the entire community understood. As monasteries grew in number and influence throughout the medieval period, their bells became timepieces for entire regions. Peasants working in nearby fields would pause in their labor when they heard the bell for sext, knowing that midday had arrived and it was time for their own meal and rest. Merchants traveling past would adjust their schedules based on the monastic hours they heard rung throughout their journey. Gradually, the eightfold rhythm of monastic prayer began to impose itself on the broader world. But keeping accurate time for these bell ringers remained a challenge. On clear days, sundials could provide reasonable guidance, But what about cloudy weather, or the long winter nights when matins had to be observed in complete darkness? Monastic communities developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for measuring time's passage. Water clocks became important tools in many monasteries. These devices, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman technology, used the steady flow of water to mark time's passage. A container with a small hole in the bottom would empty at a predictable rate, allowing monks to measure intervals even in darkness. Some water clocks were elaborate affairs with multiple vessels, float mechanisms, and even primitive alarm systems that would ring small bells when certain water levels were reached. Candle clocks provided another solution. Specially made candles of uniform thickness would burn at a steady rate, and marks carved into the wax would indicate when specific amounts of time had passed. Night prayers could be timed by watching these candles burn down to predetermined marks. Some monasteries used candles with metal pins embedded at specific intervals as the wax melted. The pins would drop onto metal plates below, creating small sounds that could wake a sleeping timekeeper. The most dedicated timekeepers developed an almost supernatural sense of time's passage. Years of practice allowed them to wake naturally at the proper hours, to sense when the right moment for each service was approaching. These human clocks, trained by decades of careful attention to natural rhythms and religious requirements, became incredibly accurate. Stories tell of monks who could ring the proper hour even when all their mechanical aids had failed. Guided by internal rhythms developed through years of faithful practice. As we move deeper into the medieval period, these monastic bells would inspire the development of more sophisticated timekeeping devices. But even as mechanical clocks began to appear in monastery towers, the essential pattern remained unchanged. Bells would ring, communities would gather, and time would be marked by the bronze voices that had first called medieval Europe to prayer. The sacred rhythms established in these early monasteries would echo through the centuries, shaping not just religious life, but the entire medieval understanding of how time should be organized, measured, and shared. As the morning sun climbs higher above the monastery walls, its rays fall upon a circular stone disc set into the courtyard pavement. Carved lines radiate from a central post, like the spokes of a wheel, and a thin shadow moves slowly across these marks, as reliable as breathing, as patient as prayer. This is a sundial, perhaps the most beautiful of all medieval timepieces, where the movement of our solar system is translated into something human eyes can read and human schedules can follow. The sundial was not a medieval invention. Ancient civilizations had long known how to read time from shadows, but medieval craftsmen and scholars refined this ancient technology into instruments of remarkable accuracy and artistic beauty. In a world where mechanical clocks were still centuries away, sundials provided the most reliable method for tracking the sun's progress across the sky, and thus for organizing the daylight hours around which so much of medieval life revolved. The principle behind sundial timekeeping is elegantly simple, yet its practical application required careful observation, mathematical calculation, and skilled craftsmanship. As the Earth rotates on its axis, the sun appears to move across the sky from east to west. A vertical post or angled blade, called a gnomon, casts a shadow whose direction and length change predictably throughout the day. By marking the positions these shadows occupy at known times, craftsmen could create permanent time-telling devices that would work reliably as long as the sun was shining. But creating an accurate sundial was far more complex than simply placing a stick in the ground and marking where its shadow fell. Medieval sundial makers had to account for the fact that the sun's path across the sky changes throughout the year. In summer, when the sun is high, shadows are short and move through a tight arc. In winter, when the sun stays low on the horizon, shadows are long and sweep through a much wider path. A sundial designed to be accurate in June would be significantly off in December, unless its maker had carefully calculated these seasonal variations. The most sophisticated medieval sundials were designed with the gnomon angled parallel to the Earth's axis, pointing toward the North Star. This arrangement, which modern sundial makers call a polar gnomon, ensures that the shadow moves at a constant rate regardless of the season. The hour lines on such sundials are not evenly spaced like those on a modern clock face, but rather are calculated according to complex mathematical formulas that account for the sun's changing declination throughout the year. Medieval monasteries became centers of sundial development because their need for accurate timekeeping coincided with communities that included some of the era's most learned men. Monk scholars studied ancient texts on astronomy and mathematics, learned to calculate the sun's position at different times of year, and developed increasingly sophisticated methods for laying out accurate hour lines. The creation of a monastery sundial might take months of careful calculation, followed by days of precise stone carving or bronze engraving. Different types of sundials evolved for different purposes and locations. Horizontal sundials, set flat on the ground or on pedestals, were perhaps the most common type found in monastery courtyards. These could be large and easily visible to many people at once. Vertical sundials were carved into south-facing walls, where they could be consulted by anyone passing by. Portable sundials, small enough to carry in a pouch, allowed travelers to keep track of time wherever their journeys might take them. The hour markings on medieval sundials reflected the unique way that medieval people divided their days. Rather than the equal hours we use today, medieval sundials typically showed temporal hours or seasonal hours, divisions of daylight that changed length with the seasons. In this system, the daylight period was always divided into 12 equal parts, regardless of whether the day was the long brightness of midsummer or the brief illumination of midwinter. A summer hour might last 75 modern minutes, while a winter hour might be only 45 minutes long. This variable hour system might seem inconvenient to our modern sensibilities, but it made perfect sense in a world where most work depended on natural light. People needed to organize their day around the available daylight, not around abstract mathematical divisions. A farmer working during harvest season didn't need to know that it was 3:00 p.m. in our modern sense. He needed to know how much daylight remained for gathering crops. The temporal hour system provided exactly this information. Creating accurate hour lines for temporal hours required even more complex calculations than fixed hour sundials. The sundial maker had to account not only for the sun's changing path, but also for the varying length of days throughout the year. Master craftsmen developed tables and calculation methods that allowed them to plot these variable hour lines with remarkable accuracy. Some medieval sundials included separate scales for different seasons, while others used ingenious mechanical adjustments to account for seasonal variations. The materials used for sundial construction varied according to local resources and the intended permanence of the device. Stone sundials, carved from limestone, marble, or slate, were built to last for centuries. Many examples from medieval monasteries can still be found today. Their hour lines were smoothed by centuries of weather, but still functional. Bronze sundials, cast in workshops that also made bells, were prized for their durability and the precision possible in metal engraving. Some wealthy individuals commissioned sundials made from precious materials, silver, gold, or exotic stones that were as much jewelry as timepieces. The decoration of sundials became an art form in itself. Religious motifs were common, with crosses, saints, or biblical inscriptions reminding users of the spiritual significance of time's passage. Latin mottos appeared frequently, offering wisdom about the fleeting nature of earthly life. Tempus fugit time feliz. Horror mortis incerta. The hour of death is uncertain. Or sign so cilia, without the sun, I am silent. These inscriptions transformed functional timekeeping devices into objects of meditation and reflection. Some medieval sundials included additional features beyond simple hour markings. Calendar scales might show the date throughout the year, Zodiacal signs could indicate the sun's position among the constellations. Lunar calendars helped track the phases of the moon, important for both agricultural and religious purposes. The most elaborate sundials became comprehensive astronomical instruments, providing information about celestial movements that went far beyond simple timekeeping. The maintenance of sundials required ongoing attention. The gnomon had to remain perfectly positioned, as any shift would throw off all the time readings. In northern climates, ice and snow could obscure the dial face for months at a time. Accumulated dirt or moss would interfere with shadow visibility. Dedicated timekeepers learned to clean and maintain their sundials as carefully as later generations would wind and oil mechanical clocks. As we shall see in coming chapters, the knowledge gained from centuries of sundial making would prove crucial when medieval craftsmen began to create the first mechanical clocks. The mathematical understanding of time division, the precision required in marking hour intervals, and the deep familiarity with astronomical movements that sundial makers developed would all contribute to the revolution in timekeeping that was slowly approaching. But for now, in the quiet monastery courtyards of medieval Europe, shadows continued their ancient dance across stone and bronze, marking the hours with a patience that would endure long after the bells had fallen silent and the monasteries had crumbled into ruin. In the scriptorium of a medieval monastery, as twilight settles over the stone buildings and the last light fades from the narrow windows, a monk continues his careful copying of sacred texts. Beside him, a thin candle burns steadily, its flame casting dancing shadows on the parchment. But this candle serves a dual purpose. Carved into its wax at regular intervals are small marks that tell the monk exactly how much time has passed since sunset. As the flame consumes each marked section, he knows another hour has slipped away into the darkness. This scene illustrates one of the great challenges of medieval timekeeping. What happens when the sun disappears? Sundials, for all their accuracy and beauty, fall silent the moment clouds cover the sun or night falls. Medieval communities needed alternative methods for measuring time during the long winter nights, when matins had to be observed in complete darkness. During cloudy weather, when sundials cast no shadows, and for indoor activities where the sun's rays never penetrated, the solutions they developed were ingenious, practical, and beautifully adapted to the materials and knowledge available to medieval craftsmen. These alternative timekeepers' water clocks, candle clocks, sand glasses, and incense clocks provided the continuous time measurement that sundials could not, ensuring that the rhythm of medieval life could continue regardless of weather or darkness. Water clocks, known in Latin as clepsydra, represented perhaps the most sophisticated of these alternative timepieces. The basic principle was elegantly simple. Water flows from one container to another at a predictable rate, and by measuring either the amount that has flowed out or the level that remains, one can determine how much time has passed. But the practical implementation of this simple idea required considerable skill and careful attention to detail. The most common type of medieval water clock consisted of a large bronze or ceramic vessel with a small hole near the bottom. As water drained through this hole, the falling water level would reveal time markings carved on the inside of the container. These markings had to be carefully calculated, because water pressure decreases as the container empties, causing the flow rate to slow down. A skilled craftsman would test his water clock over many days, adjusting the markings until they accurately reflected equal time intervals. More elaborate water clocks used a series of connected vessels to maintain constant water pressure and therefore steady flow rates. Water would flow from an upper reservoir into a measuring chamber, then overflow at a consistent level into a collection basin below. These complex systems could run for many hours without attention, providing reliable timekeeping throughout the night watches when human observers might fall asleep. Some monasteries developed water clocks with ingenious alarm mechanisms. Float systems would rise or fall with changing water levels, eventually triggering bells, chimes, or other signals when predetermined times were reached. A monk responsible for waking the community for night prayers could set such a device before retiring, confident that it would sound the proper alert even if he slept deeply. The accuracy of water clocks depended heavily on environmental conditions. Water flows differently at different temperatures, more slowly when cold, faster when warm. Medieval timekeepers learned to account for these variations, sometimes maintaining heated chambers where their water clocks could operate at consistent temperatures. They also discovered that different types of water produce different flow rates, with pure rainwater being preferred over mineral-rich well water that might leave deposits and clog the delicate flow holes. Candle clocks offered a simpler but equally effective alternative for indoor timekeeping. Specially made candles of uniform thickness and composition would burn at predictable rates, typically consuming about an inch of length per hour. Time intervals could be marked directly on the candle with a knife, creating visible indicators of time's passage. As the flame consumed each marked section, observers could tell exactly how much time had elapsed. Different types of wax and wick materials produce different burn rates, allowing craftsmen to create candles calibrated for specific purposes. Beeswax candles, expensive but clean burning, were preferred for precise timekeeping. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were cheaper but burned less consistently. The size and material of the wick also affected burn rate. Too large a wick would cause the candle to burn too quickly, while too small a wick might cause the flame to gutter out. Some candle clocks incorporated sophisticated features that enhanced their reliability. Metal pins or nails embedded in the wax at specific intervals would drop onto metal plates as the wax melted away, creating audible signals at predetermined times. Weighted strings attached to the candle at measured points would fall when the flame reached them, potentially triggering bells or other alarm mechanisms. These devices could wake a sleeping timekeeper or signal the approach of scheduled activities. The creation of accurate candle clocks required the same kind of careful calculation and testing that went into sundial making. Craftsmen would burn dozens of test candles under controlled conditions, measuring exactly how long each section took to consume. Temperature, humidity, and air movement all affected burn rates, so experienced candle clockmakers learned to account for these variables in their calculations. Sand clocks, which we know today as hourglasses, appeared in medieval Europe sometime during the 14th century. Though similar devices had been used in other parts of the world much earlier, these instruments used the steady flow of fine sand through a narrow opening to measure specific time intervals. Unlike water clocks, sand clocks were not affected by temperature changes, making them particularly useful for maritime navigation, where accurate timekeeping was crucial for calculating position and speed. The construction of accurate sand clocks required specialized knowledge of both glass making and granular materials. The glass bulbs had to be perfectly shaped and connected with an opening of precisely the right size. Too large an opening would allow the sand to flow too quickly. Too small an opening might cause the sand to stick and stop flowing altogether. The sand itself had to be carefully prepared, sifted to uniform grain size, dried to prevent clumping, and sometimes treated with special materials to improve flow characteristics. Medieval sand clocks were typically made to measure specific standard intervals, 1 hour, half an hour, or quarter-hour periods. Unlike water clocks or candle clocks, they could not easily be marked for intermediate time readings. This limitation was balanced by their portability and reliability. A traveler could carry a small sand clock in his pack and have accurate timekeeping wherever his journey might take him. Incense clocks, while less common in medieval Europe than in Asia, provided another alternative for measuring time through the controlled consumption of aromatic materials. Specially prepared incense mixtures would burn at known rates, with different scents sometimes used to mark different time periods. These devices served the dual purpose of timekeeping and creating pleasant aromas for meditation or prayer. The maintenance and care of these alternative timepieces became an important skill in medieval communities. Water clocks needed regular cleaning to prevent algae growth and mineral deposits. The flow holes required careful attention, as even small obstructions could throw off timing significantly. Candle clocks demanded protection from drafts that might cause uneven burning. Sand clocks needed to be turned promptly when their sand ran out, and their narrow necks kept clear of any blockages. Together, these various timekeeping methods provided medieval communities with the tools they needed to organize their days and nights with reasonable precision. While none could match the accuracy of a modern clock, they were remarkably effective for their intended purposes. A monastery equipped with sundials for day use, water clocks for night hours, and candle clocks for backup timing could maintain its schedule of prayers and activities with clockwork regularity, even though mechanical clocks had not yet been invented. As we'll explore in our next chapter, the knowledge gained from creating and using these diverse timekeeping devices would prove crucial when medieval craftsmen began to develop the first mechanical clocks. The understanding of regular motion, the precision required in calibration, and the practical experience of measuring time intervals would all contribute to the mechanical revolution that was slowly taking shape in medieval workshops and monastery towers. In a monastery workshop somewhere in medieval Europe, perhaps in the year 1180, a craftsman bends over his workbench by the light of oil lamps. Before him lie pieces that seem almost alive in their complexity. Bronze wheels with carefully cut teeth, iron springs wound tight with potential energy, and wooden gears shaped with the precision that only years of practice can achieve. He is creating something that has never existed before, a device that will mark time not by flowing water or burning wax, but through the controlled release of mechanical energy. This is the birth of the mechanical clock, and with it begins a revolution that will eventually transform not just how we measure time, but how we understand our relationship with time itself. The development of mechanical clocks in medieval Europe was not the work of a single inventor, or even a single generation. Like a slow river carving through stone, the evolution from simple timekeeping aids to complex mechanical devices took place over centuries, with each improvement building upon the discoveries and innovations of earlier craftsmen. The story of these early clocks is really the story of human ingenuity applied to one of our most fundamental challenges: how to create a device that can divide time into regular, measurable intervals without depending on external forces like sun, water, or fire. The key breakthrough that made mechanical clocks possible was the development of what clockmakers call the escapement mechanism. This ingenious device solved a problem that had puzzled inventors for centuries: how to control the release of energy from a wound spring or falling weight so that it provides steady, regular impulses rather than one sudden burst of motion. The escapement acts like a mechanical heartbeat, allowing energy to be released in small, measured amounts that can drive the regular movement of gears and hands. The earliest mechanical escapements were remarkably simple in concept, though extraordinarily difficult to execute with the tools and materials available to medieval craftsmen. The most common early design was called the verge escapement, which consisted of a vertical rod with two small paddles or flags positioned at right angles to each other. This rod would oscillate back and forth, alternately catching and releasing the teeth of a gear wheel, allowing the wheel to advance by exactly one tooth with each oscillation. Creating an effective verge escapement required precision that pushed medieval metalworking to its limits. The gear teeth had to be cut to exactly the right shape and spacing. The pivot points had to be perfectly aligned and smooth enough to minimize friction. The pallets that caught and released the gear teeth needed to be hardened and polished to resist wear. A single flaw in any of these components could cause the entire mechanism to run irregularly or stop altogether. The energy to drive these early clocks came primarily from falling weights. A heavy stone or iron weight would be suspended from a rope or chain wound around a drum. As gravity pulled the weight downward, it would turn the drum, which was connected through a series of gears to the escapement mechanism. The escapement would control how quickly the weight could fall, ensuring that its energy was released steadily over many hours rather than all at once. These weight-driven clocks presented their own unique challenges. The driving force from the weight decreased as it fell, because the leverage effect of the rope winding around the drum changed. Clockmakers had to design their gear trains to compensate for this variation, often using specially shaped cams or fusee mechanisms to maintain consistent force throughout the clock's running time. The earliest mechanical clocks were enormous devices, often taking up entire rooms in monastery towers or civic buildings. They were built primarily from iron and wood, materials that medieval craftsmen understood well, but that posed significant challenges for precision timekeeping. Iron gears would expand and contract with temperature changes, affecting the clock's accuracy. Wooden components would swell with humidity or shrink in dry conditions. Early clockmakers learned to account for these environmental effects, but achieving consistent accuracy remained extremely difficult. These early clocks were not equipped with faces or hands as we know them today. Instead, they typically struck bells or gongs to announce the hours, serving essentially as automated bell ringers that could maintain their schedule without human intervention. The mechanism would trip a hammer that would strike a bell once for 1 o'clock, twice for 2 o'clock, and so forth. Some of the most elaborate early clocks could strike different sequences for different types of hours: canonical hours for religious services, temporal hours that varied with the seasons, or the equal hours that were gradually becoming more common in urban areas. The construction of one of these early mechanical clocks was a massive undertaking that might occupy a team of craftsmen for months or even years. The project typically began with the creation of a sturdy iron framework that would support the entire mechanism. This framework had to be precisely aligned and solidly anchored, as any shifting or vibration would affect the clock's accuracy. Next came the cutting of gear wheels, a process that required both mathematical calculation and extraordinary manual skill. Each gear had to be precisely sized to work with its neighboring gears in the train. The number of teeth on each wheel determined the ratios that would ultimately control how fast the hands moved or how often the bells struck. Medieval clockmakers developed specialized tools for cutting gear teeth, including filing guides and measuring devices that helped ensure consistent spacing and angles. The assembly of these early clocks was as much art as craft. Each component had to be fitted and adjusted in relation to all the others. The escapement required particularly careful attention, as even small misalignments could prevent the clock from running at all. The striking mechanism needed to be timed precisely to coincide with the hour indications. Every bearing surface had to be lubricated with carefully prepared oils or animal fats to reduce friction and wear. Testing and adjustment of a newly completed clock could take weeks. The clockmaker would observe its performance under different conditions, making tiny adjustments to the escapement timing, the gear mesh, or the weight system to achieve the best possible accuracy. Even then, early mechanical clocks were considered quite accurate if they gained or last only 15 or 20 minutes per day, a level of precision that seems poor by modern standards, but represented a remarkable achievement for the time. The social impact of these early mechanical clocks was profound, though it developed gradually over many decades. For the first time in human history, communities had access to timekeeping devices that could run continuously, day and night, regardless of weather conditions. The regular striking of clock bells began to impose a new kind of temporal discipline on urban life, creating shared reference points around which activities could be coordinated. Medieval chroniclers began to notice changes in how people thought about and organized time. Appointments could be made with greater precision. Work schedules could be coordinated more effectively. The abstract concept of measured time began to take on a reality that influenced daily life in ways that sundials and water clocks never could. As word of these mechanical marvels spread, demand grew for clocks in civic buildings, churches, and eventually private homes. This demand drove continued innovation and improvement, as clockmakers competed to create devices that were more accurate, more reliable, and more elaborate in their features. The stage was set for the next phase of clock development, when these large tower clocks would evolve into smaller, more sophisticated devices that could bring precise timekeeping into every corner of medieval society. High above the bustling marketplace of a medieval city, in the stone tower of the cathedral or town hall, a massive mechanical presence keeps its steady vigil over the community below. This is a tower clock, perhaps weighing several tons, its iron framework filled with bronze gears larger than wagon wheels, its wooden escape wheel rotating with the patience of centuries. Every hour, the deep bronze voice of its bell rolls across the red tile roofs, through the narrow streets, into workshops and homes, calling an entire community to shared awareness of time's passage. Tower clocks represent the magnificent flowering of medieval mechanical timekeeping, the moment when individual innovations in monastic workshops expanded to serve entire communities. These remarkable devices, built between roughly 1300 and 1500, were among the most complex mechanical achievements of their era, requiring the coordination of multiple crafts, metallurgy, carpentry, bell-making, and the emerging discipline of clockmaking itself to create instruments that would serve their communities for centuries. The construction of a tower clock was a civic undertaking of enormous significance, comparable to building a cathedral or fortifying city walls. These projects required substantial financial investment, often funded through special taxes, donations from wealthy merchants, or contributions from craft guilds. The decision to build a tower clock represented a community's commitment to a new way of organizing time, a declaration that the city or town had achieved sufficient prosperity and sophistication to require precise, public timekeeping. The physical scale of these early tower clocks was truly impressive. The mechanism of the famous clock at Salisbury Cathedral, built around 1386, fills a room nearly 20 feet square. Its driving weights, made of stone blocks encased in iron, weigh over half a ton each. The escape wheel, carved from seasoned oak and bound with iron, measures more than 6 feet in diameter. When this clock strikes the hour, the hammer that hits the bell weighs nearly 100 pounds, delivering a blow that can be heard for miles across the countryside. The installation of such mechanisms required careful planning and engineering that challenged medieval builders. The tower had to be strong enough to support not only the weight of the clockwork itself, but also the dynamic forces created by the swinging bells, the oscillating escapement, and the movement of the heavy driving weights. Special rooms were constructed within towers to house the clockwork, with carefully designed foundations that would isolate the mechanism from vibrations while providing stable mounting points for the massive iron framework. The gear trains of tower clocks were marvels of medieval mechanical engineering, starting from the slow rotation of the weight drum, perhaps 1 revolution per hour. The gears had to multiply this motion through carefully calculated ratios to achieve the proper speeds for different functions. One set of gears might drive an hour hand that completed 1 revolution every 12 hours, while another set controlled the striking mechanism that had to operate precisely at each hour mark. These gear trains were cut entirely by hand, using techniques that required extraordinary skill and patience. The largest gears, sometimes containing more than 100 teeth, were typically made of bronze cast in carefully prepared molds, then filed and finished by hand to achieve the precise shapes necessary for smooth operation. Smaller gears might be cut from wrought iron, heated in charcoal forges, and shaped on anvils while still hot enough to work. The precision required was remarkable. An error of even a few degrees in the angle of a single tooth could cause the entire mechanism to jam or run irregularly. The escapement mechanisms of tower clocks evolved considerably from the simple verge systems used in the earliest mechanical timepieces. Many tower clocks employed what clockmakers called a foliot escapement, which used a horizontal bar with adjustable weights to control the timing. By moving these weights closer to or farther from the center of the bar, the clock's keeper could fine-tune its rate, compensating for changes in temperature, wear in the mechanism, or variations in the driving force. Some of the most sophisticated tower clocks included multiple functions beyond simple timekeeping. Astronomical displays showed the phases of the moon, the positions of planets, or the signs of the zodiac. Calendar mechanisms tracked the date, accounting for the different lengths of months and even the complex calculations necessary for determining Easter each year. Elaborate figurines might emerge from hidden doors to mark the hours, dancing bears, jousting knights, or religious figures that acted out brief scenes as the clock struck. The famous astronomical clock at Prague, begun in 1410, represents the pinnacle of medieval clock complexity. In addition to showing the time, it displays the position of the sun and moon in the sky, indicates which saint's day is being celebrated, shows the current astrological sign, and features an elaborate procession of the 12 apostles who appear in windows above the clock face every hour. The mathematical and mechanical knowledge required to create such a device pushed medieval technology to its absolute limits. The maintenance of tower clocks was a specialized profession that required deep understanding of the mechanism's operation. The clockkeeper, often appointed by the city government or cathedral chapter, was responsible for winding the weights daily, oiling the bearings, adjusting the escapement as needed, and making minor repairs. This was a position of considerable responsibility, as the entire community depended on the clock's accuracy for coordinating their activities. Daily maintenance routines were carefully prescribed and followed religiously. Each morning, the clock keeper would climb the tower to wind the driving weights back to their highest position, a task that might require dozens of turns of a large windlass. He would check all the moving parts for signs of wear or damage, listening to the rhythm of the escapement to detect any irregularities. Oil made from rendered animal fat would be applied to bearing surfaces, and accumulated dust and debris would be carefully cleaned away. The social impact of tower clocks on medieval communities was profound and far-reaching. For the first time, entire populations had access to a shared, public timekeeper that operated continuously regardless of weather or season. The regular striking of the hour bells created a common temporal framework that could coordinate the activities of thousands of people simultaneously. Markets and fairs began to operate on precise schedules, with opening and closing times announced by the tower clock. Craft guilds used the clock strikes to coordinate work schedules and break times. Legal proceedings could be scheduled with greater precision, and contractors might specify performance times based on the public clock's hours rather than vague references to natural phenomena. The psychological impact of living within earshot of a tower clock was equally significant. The regular mechanical rhythm of the hourly bells created a new awareness of time's passage that gradually replaced the more fluid, organic relationship with time that had characterized earlier centuries. People began to think of time as something that could be measured, saved, wasted, or bought, concepts that would eventually become fundamental to modern economic and social organization. Different communities developed their own traditions around their tower clocks. Some cities had elaborate ceremonies for winding the clock or celebrating its installation anniversary. Others developed folk belief about the clock's spiritual significance, seeing it as a guardian of community welfare or a symbol of civic pride. The failure of a tower clock was often viewed as an ominous sign, while its restoration was cause for celebration. As tower clocks became more common throughout Europe, a network of knowledge and expertise developed among clockmakers. Traveling craftsmen would move from city to city, installing new clocks or repairing existing ones, carrying innovations and improvements with them. Guild systems emerged to regulate the clockmaking trade, establishing standards for training apprentices and maintaining quality in construction and repair work. The success of tower clocks also drove innovation in related technologies. Bell making became more sophisticated as founders learned to create bells with precisely tuned pitches for clock striking. Metalworking techniques improved to meet the demands of gear cutting and precision assembly. Even architectural practices evolved, as builders learned to design towers that could properly house and support these massive mechanical devices. By the end of the medieval period, tower clocks had become essential features of European civic life. Nearly every major city, cathedral town, and prosperous market center had installed its own public timekeeper. These mechanical sentinels, marking the hours with bronze voices that carried across the countryside, had fundamentally transformed the medieval relationship with time, preparing the way for even more dramatic changes that would come with the development of smaller, more personal timekeeping devices in the centuries to follow. In the smoky darkness of a medieval foundry, where the air shimmers with heat and the earth floor is packed hard from centuries of use, master craftsmen prepared to perform one of the most magical transformations of the medieval world. They are about to turn ordinary metals into bronze, and bronze into bells, those sacred voices that would carry time's message across medieval landscapes for hundreds of years. The bell-making craft combined metallurgy, acoustics, artistry, and spiritual devotion into a process that was as much ritual as it was technology. The creation of a medieval bell began long before the bronze was heated to molten brightness. It started with careful planning, precise calculations, and the gathering of materials that would determine not just the bell's size and appearance, but its voice, that unique combination of fundamental tone, harmonics, and resonance that would make each bell as individual as a human fingerprint. A master bell founder needed to be part mathematician, part metallurgist, part artist, and part priest, for the bells he created would serve not just functional but deeply spiritual purposes. The bronze used for bell making was itself a carefully balanced alloy, typically consisting of about 3 parts copper to 1 part tin, though master founders guarded their exact formulas as precious secrets. The proportion of these metals determined the bell's tone quality, durability, and resistance to cracking under repeated striking. Too much tin made the bronze brittle and prone to shattering. Too little tin resulted in a soft metal that would work quickly and produce a dull, muffled tone. The finest bells achieved a perfect balance that would allow them to ring clearly for centuries. The copper and tin came from mines scattered across medieval Europe and beyond. Copper might arrive from the mountains of Central Europe, while tin often came from as far away as Cornwall in England. The quality of these raw materials varied considerably, and experienced bell founders learned to recognize the subtle differences that would affect their final product. They would test small samples, noting the color of the molten metal, the way it flowed, and the sound it made when struck after cooling. The actual process of bell making began with the construction of a complex system of clay molds that would shape the molten bronze. The core mold, shaped like the interior of the finished bell, was built up on a wooden framework using specially prepared clay mixed with horsehair, chopped straw, and other organic materials that would burn away during casting to prevent cracking. This core had to be perfectly shaped and thoroughly dried, a process that could take weeks in carefully controlled conditions. Around this core, the bell makers would build and coat the outer mold that would shape the bell's exterior surface. This involved creating a wooden template with the exact profile of the desired bell, then using this template to carve the proper shape in more specially prepared clay. Any decorations, inscriptions, or raised designs had to be carved into this outer mold as mirror images, since they would appear reversed on the finished bell. The gap between the core and cope molds would determine the thickness of the bell's walls, and getting this exactly right required years of experience and careful calculation. Too thick, and the bell would be heavy and dull-toned. Too thin, and it might crack under the stress of repeated striking. Master bell founders developed rule-of-thumb formulas for calculating proper wall thickness based on the bell's intended size and pitch, but each casting was still an exercise in controlled risk. Medieval inscriptions on bells were often deeply meaningful, reflecting both the bell's practical purpose and its spiritual significance. Latin phrases were most common. Vox Domini in virtue, the voice of the Lord in power. Audo diem virum. Plebum voco. Congrego clerum. I praise the true God. I call the people. I gather the clergy. Or defunctus ploro. Nimbos fugo. Festa decoro. I mourn the dead. I chase away storms. I honor festivals. Some bells bore the names of saints, dates of creation, or the names of the craftsmen who made them. The creation of these inscriptions required considerable skill in reverse lettering and careful attention to depth and clarity. The letters had to be deep enough to show clearly on the finished bell, but not so deep as to weaken the metal. Many bell inscriptions included decorative elements, crosses, floral patterns, coats of arms, or religious symbols that were carved with equal care and precision. The actual casting day was a community event of great significance. The furnaces had to be heated to precisely the right temperature, hot enough to melt the bronze completely and allow it to flow smoothly, but not so hot as to burn up the tin component or create excessive gas bubbles in the metal. The timing had to be perfect, as molten bronze begins to solidify quickly once removed from the heat. Multiple furnaces were typically used for large bells, with the bronze from each furnace flowing simultaneously into the mold through carefully positioned channels. The pourers had to work in perfect coordination, maintaining steady, even flow rates that would fill the mold completely without creating air pockets or cold joints where different streams of metal met. A single mistake in pouring could ruin months of preparation and waste expensive materials. The cooling process required its own specialized knowledge and patience. Bronze contracts as it cools, and this shrinkage had to be carefully controlled to prevent cracking or distortion. The cooling rate could be adjusted by covering the mold with sand or ash, by controlling air circulation around the casting pit, or by the careful application of heat to specific areas. Master founders learned to read the subtle signs that indicated how the cooling was progressing, the color changes in the exposed bronze, the sounds made by contracting metal, the feel of radiated heat. Once the bronze had cooled completely, the delicate process of removing the molds could begin. The outer coat was carefully broken away, revealing the bell's exterior surface for the first time. Any casting flaws, rough spots, gas bubbles, or incomplete filling would be immediately apparent. Minor flaws could sometimes be filed or ground away, but major defects meant that the entire casting would have to be melted down and begun again. The interior core was removed through the bell's mouth, a process that required careful work to avoid damaging the newly cast bronze. Once cleaned, the bell could be tested for the first time, suspended from temporary supports and struck with wooden mallets to evaluate its tone. This moment was always one of high anxiety for the bell makers, as no amount of calculation could guarantee that the bell would have the desired voice until it was actually heard. Tuning a newly cast bell was a precise art that required both musical knowledge and metalworking skill. If the bell's pitch was too high, metal could be carefully removed from specific areas, the inside of the crown for minor adjustments, or the lip for more significant changes. If the pitch was too low, however, there was no remedy except recasting, as adding metal to a finished bell was practically impossible with medieval technology. The harmonics of a bell, the complex pattern of overtones that gave each bell its distinctive character, were even more difficult to control. A well-tuned bell would produce not just its fundamental note, but a series of related harmonics that created a rich, full sound. Poor harmonics could make a bell sound harsh, discordant, or simply unpleasant to hear. Master bell founders developed an almost supernatural ability to predict and control these subtle acoustic properties. The finishing work on medieval bells was often elaborate and beautiful. The bronze surface might be polished to a mirror finish, or deliberately textured to create specific visual effects. Raised decorations were carefully refined with files and chisels, Some bells received additional decorative treatments, inlays of other metals, painted designs, or even precious metal gilding for the most important installations. The installation of a completed bell was another ceremony of great significance. The bell had to be transported to its tower, often requiring special equipment and many workers to manage weights that could exceed several tons. The bell frame and hanging system had to be precisely engineered to support the bell's weight, while allowing it to swing freely. The clapper had to be perfectly balanced and positioned to strike the bell at exactly the right spot for optimal tone. Different regions developed their own traditions and techniques for bell making, creating distinctive regional styles that experts could recognize by sight and sound. English bells tended to be lighter and higher pitched than their continental counterparts. German bells often featured elaborate decorative schemes. Italian bells were known for their particularly sweet tones. These regional differences reflected not just local preferences, but variations in available materials, climate conditions, and cultural traditions. The social status of bell founders was generally quite high in medieval society. They were respected craftsmen whose work was essential to both religious and civic life. Many became wealthy through their specialized knowledge, and some bell founding families maintained their trade secrets through multiple generations. The most successful masters might be called upon to cast bells for cathedrals, royal chapels, or major civic installations. Commissions that brought both substantial payment and lasting fame. Guild organizations developed to regulate the bell-making trade, establishing standards for apprenticeship, controlling the quality of work, and protecting the economic interests of established masters. These guilds often had their own patron saints, feast days, and ceremonial traditions that reinforced the spiritual as well as economic significance of their craft. The bells created by these medieval craftsmen were built to last for centuries, and many of them have indeed survived to the present day. Their bronze voices continue to mark the hours in cathedrals and churches across Europe, carrying forward the same sounds that marked time for medieval communities centuries ago. In their enduring presence, we can still hear echoes of the patient craftsmanship, spiritual devotion, and technical mastery that characterized medieval bell making at its finest. As the first pale light of dawn touches the stone walls of our medieval town, the air is still and quiet, filled with the soft sounds of a world slowly awakening. Then, cutting through the silence with bronze clarity, comes the call that will organize the next 16 hours of community life, the bell for lords, ringing from the cathedral tower, its voice rolling across the red tile roofs, down the narrow streets, through shuttered windows and into the dreams of sleeping citizens. This is more than just a timekeeper sounding. This is the beginning of a carefully orchestrated day in which every activity, every gathering, every pause will be coordinated by the bronze voices that have become the heartbeat of medieval society. To understand medieval life, one must understand the profound role that bells played in organizing not just time, but the entire rhythm of community existence. These bronze voices did more than simply announce the hours. They called people to prayer, summoned them to markets, warned of dangers, celebrated victories, mourned losses, and created the temporal framework within which medieval society functioned. The bells were, in very real sense, the nervous system of medieval communities, carrying information and coordination signals that allowed complex social activities to unfold with remarkable precision, despite the absence of personal timepieces or modern communication systems. The basic rhythm of medieval days was established by the canonical hours, those 8 periods of prayer that monasteries had developed centuries earlier, but which had gradually become the temporal backbone for entire communities. Matins sounded before dawn, served as a wake-up call for early rising craftsmen and farmers who needed to begin work with the first available light. Lauds, rung at dawn itself, marked the official beginning of the community's day. Prime, at early morning, coincided with the opening of shops and markets, Terce at mid-morning often marked break times for workers. Sext at noon brought the midday meal and rest period. None in mid-afternoon signaled the resumption of work after the hottest part of the day. Vespers at evening marked the end of most work activities and the beginning of family time. Compline, before sleep, provided a final call to prayer and a signal for the community to settle into night's quiet. But medieval bells carried far more complex information than this basic eightfold rhythm might suggest. Different patterns of ringing conveyed different types of messages, creating a sophisticated communication system that could reach every corner of a community simultaneously. A single measured tolling might announce a death, with the number of strokes indicating the age of the deceased. Rapid, continuous ringing could warn of fire, flood, or military attack. Festive pealing patterns celebrated weddings, victories, or religious holidays. The arrival of important visitors might be announced with special sequences that identified their status and importance. The craft of bell ringing developed its own specialized knowledge and techniques, passed down through generations of ringers who learned to read time and occasion in the bronze voices they controlled. Different bells in the same tower were often tuned to specific pitches, allowing ringers to create musical sequences that could convey complex information. A practiced ringer could make his bell speak in ways that the entire community could understand: joyful cascades for celebrations, solemn single tolls for mourning, urgent alarm patterns for emergencies. Market activities were particularly dependent on bell signals for their organization. The opening bell for the weekly market brought merchants streaming in from surrounding villages, their carts loaded with goods to sell. Different bells might announce the opening of different types of trade, one for grain merchants, another for livestock, a third for craft goods. The closing bell ensured that all business was completed before darkness fell, preventing disputes and ensuring that traveling merchants could find lodging for the night. Legal proceedings were also coordinated through bell signals. Court sessions began when the appropriate bell sounded, ensuring that all parties, judges, advocates, witnesses, and observers would gather at the proper time. The bell that announced the end of legal proceedings for the day provided a deadline that everyone understood and respected. Some communities used special bell patterns to announce the verdicts of important trials, allowing the news to spread throughout the town within minutes. Craft guilds developed their own relationships with the community's bells, using them to coordinate the complex activities of medieval manufacturing and commerce. The bell that announced the beginning of the workday ensured that all guild members would start their activities simultaneously, creating the coordination necessary for complex projects that involved multiple craftsmen. Break bells provided shared rest periods when guild members could discuss technical problems, share news, or conduct guild business. The end-of-day bell ensured that all work stopped at the same time, preventing some craftsmen from gaining unfair advantage by working longer hours. Agricultural activities, too, were coordinated through bell signals, despite taking place primarily outside the town walls. Seasonal bells announced the proper times for planting, cultivating, and harvesting. Special patterns might call for communal work activities, times when all available hands were needed for urgent tasks like bringing in the harvest before threatening weather, or repairing flood damage to shared resources like mills or bridges. The social stratification of medieval society was reflected in how different groups responded to bell signals. Nobles and wealthy merchants might have the luxury of ignoring some bells, relying on personal servants to manage their schedules. Craft guild masters had some flexibility in how they organized their response to community bells, while journeymen and apprentices were expected to conform precisely to the signals. Peasants and laborers had the least autonomy, with their entire daily rhythm dictated by the bronze voices that rang across the community. Religious life, naturally, remained closely tied to bell signals throughout the medieval period. The canonical hours continued to provide the basic framework for community prayer, but bells also announced special services, feast days, and seasonal celebrations. The bells that called people to Sunday Mass created one of the most important social gathering times of the week, when the entire community would come together in shared worship and social interaction. The psychological impact of living within this bell-organized world was profound and lasting. Medieval people developed an almost intuitive understanding of time's passage through their familiarity with bell patterns. They could tell not just the hour, but the season, the day of the week, and the type of activities that were appropriate at any given moment, all by listening to the bronze voices that surrounded them from birth to death. Children growing up in medieval communities absorbed this temporal knowledge naturally, learning to recognize different bell patterns before they could read or write. They knew which bells meant playtime was over and chores must begin, which signals announced feast days when special foods might be available, which patterns warned of danger and required them to seek shelter immediately. The integration of bell signals into medieval life was so complete that their absence was profoundly disturbing. Chronicles record the distress felt by communities when their bells were silenced by war, by technical problems, or by religious interdicts that prohibited their use. Without their bronze guides, medieval people felt genuinely lost, unable to coordinate their activities effectively or maintain their accustomed rhythm of life. Different types of bells served specialized functions within this complex system. The largest bells, requiring the most effort to ring, were reserved for the most important announcements, major feast days, emergencies, or events of community-wide significance. Smaller bells handled routine time signals and less critical communications. Some towers included bells tuned to specific musical intervals, allowing ringers to create melodic sequences that were both beautiful and informationally rich. Weather conditions affected how bell signals traveled and how communities responded to them. In fog or heavy rain, sound carried differently, and ringers had to adjust their patterns to ensure that important messages reached all parts of the community. Winter snow could muffle bell sounds, while summer heat could make the bronze ring with unusual clarity. Experienced community members learned to account for these seasonal variations in how they interpreted the messages carried on the wind. The maintenance of this bell-based communication system required constant attention and significant resources. Bell ringers had to be trained, scheduled, and compensated for their work. The bells themselves needed regular maintenance, and the tower's structures required ongoing repair and reinforcement. Communities that could not maintain their bells effectively found their social organization suffering as coordination and communication became more difficult. As medieval society grew more complex and commerce expanded beyond local boundaries, the bell-based system of temporal organization began to encounter limitations. Merchants traveling between communities had to learn different bell patterns for each town they visited. Legal and commercial agreements between distant communities required time references that could be understood across different bell-ringing traditions. The stage was being set for innovations that would eventually supplement and partially replace the ancient bronze voices that had organized medieval life for so many centuries. In the private chamber of a wealthy merchant's house, as the last light of evening fades beyond the diamond-paned windows, a small mechanical marvel sits upon a carved oak table. No larger than a jewelry box, its brass case gleams in the candlelight, and from within comes the soft, rhythmic ticking that marks the birth of personal time. This is a domestic clock, perhaps one of the first timepieces small enough to grace a private home, and its quiet voice represents a revolution as significant as any political upheaval of the medieval period, the moment when timekeeping moved from the public realm of towers and bells into the intimate spaces where individual lives unfold. The development of smaller, more personal timepieces marked a fundamental shift in medieval society's relationship with time. Where community life had previously been organized around the shared bronze voices of tower clocks and church bells, the emergence of domestic and portable timepieces began to create opportunities for private schedules, individual timing, and personal temporal autonomy that had never before existed in human history. The technical challenges involved in creating these smaller timepieces were enormous, requiring innovations in virtually every aspect of clock-making technology. The massive iron frameworks and stone weights that power tower clocks clearly could not be scaled down to domestic size while maintaining their effectiveness. Entirely new approaches to storing and releasing mechanical energy had to be developed, along with precision manufacturing techniques that could create reliable mechanisms small enough to fit on a table or carry in a traveling pack. The breakthrough that made portable clocks possible was the development of the mainspring, a ribbon of specially hardened steel that could be coiled tightly to store energy, then allowed to unwind slowly to power the clock mechanism. Creating effective mainsprings required metallurgical knowledge that pushed medieval technology to its limits. The steel had to be precisely tempered to provide the right combination of strength and elasticity. Too soft, and the spring would not store enough energy or would deform permanently. Too hard, and it would become brittle and snap under the stress of repeated winding and unwinding. The process of making mainsprings was closely guarded by the craftsmen who developed the techniques. The steel had to be forged to exactly the right thickness and width, then carefully heat-treated to achieve the proper temper. The surface had to be perfectly smooth to prevent stress concentrations that could lead to cracking. Even tiny flaws in the metal or errors in the tempering process could cause a spring to fail after only a few cycles of winding and unwinding. Early mainspring-powered clocks faced the challenge of providing consistent power as the spring unwound. A fully wound mainspring delivers much more force than one that is nearly exhausted. Yet the clock's escapement needs steady, even power to maintain accurate timekeeping. Medieval clockmakers developed an ingenious solution called the fusee, a cone-shaped pulley connected to the mainspring by a length of chain or gut cord. As the mainspring unwound and its force decreased, the chain wound onto a larger diameter portion of the fusee, providing mechanical advantage that compensated for the spring's weakening power. The creation of fusees required mathematical understanding and precision manufacturing that challenged even the most skilled medieval craftsmen. The shape of the cone had to be calculated to exactly match the power curve of the mainspring, and the surface had to be cut with spiral grooves that would guide the chain smoothly without binding or slipping. The chain itself had to be made with links of perfectly uniform size and strength, each one individually forged and fitted by hand. Domestic clocks of the medieval period were typically much simpler in function than their tower-dwelling relatives. Most showed only the hours, lacking the complex astronomical displays or multiple time scales that characterized public timepieces. The clock faces were often small and utilitarian, with Roman numerals marking the hours and a single hand indicating the time. These limitations were partly due to size constraints, but also reflected the practical needs of their users. Private individuals needed basic timekeeping, rather than elaborate displays of mechanical virtuosity. The cases for domestic clocks became opportunities for artistic expression and displays of wealth. Brass was the preferred material for the finest examples, as it was both durable and beautiful when polished to a golden shine. The brass was often engraved with decorative patterns, religious motifs, or the owner's coat of arms. Some cases incorporated architectural elements, tiny columns, arches, or buttresses that echoed the Gothic style of the great cathedrals where the larger clocks resided. Wooden cases were more common for less expensive timepieces, crafted from fine hardwoods like walnut, oak, or cherry. These might be carved with elaborate decorative schemes or inlaid with precious materials. The woodworking techniques required for clock cases pushed medieval joinery to new levels of precision, as the case had to protect the delicate mechanism while allowing access for winding and maintenance. The social implications of domestic clocks were profound and far-reaching. For the first time, wealthy individuals could organize their private lives according to personal schedules, rather than community-wide bell signals. Appointments could be made with greater precision, Personal devotions could be timed exactly, and daily routines could be managed independently of external time signals. Merchants were among the first to recognize the practical advantages of personal timepieces. Business negotiations could be conducted with reference to precise timing that both parties could verify. Contracts could specify performance times that didn't depend on the availability of public time signals. International trade became more feasible as merchants could coordinate activities across different time zones and local customs. The scholar class also embraced domestic clocks enthusiastically. Medieval universities began to organize lectures and academic activities around clock time, rather than the approximate timing of sundials or bells. This precision enabled more complex scheduling of educational activities and allowed for better coordination between different institutions. Students could budget their study time more effectively, and researchers could conduct experiments that required precise timing. Portable timepieces represented an even greater technical achievement than domestic clocks, requiring mechanisms that could maintain accuracy despite the jolting and movement of travel. The earliest portable clocks were really just small domestic clocks housed in sturdy traveling cases, but true portability required innovations in escapement design, spring mounting, and case construction that could withstand the rigors of medieval travel. The escapements used in portable clocks had to be much more robust than those in stationary timepieces. Road vibrations could easily disrupt the delicate balance of a foliate escapement, causing the clock to gain or lose time unpredictably. Medieval clockmakers experimented with various solutions, including heavier balance wheels, different pivot arrangements, and shock-absorbing mounting systems that could isolate the escapement from external disturbances. Cases for portable clocks required special attention to protection and durability. The mechanisms had to be sealed against dust and moisture while traveling, yet remain accessible for winding and adjustment. Locks and latches had to be strong enough to prevent accidental opening during transport. Some portable clocks were housed in leather cases lined with soft fabric to cushion the mechanism, while others used metal cases with carefully fitted joints that could exclude dirt and dampness. The users of portable clocks were typically members of the highest levels of medieval society: nobles, high-ranking clergy, wealthy merchants, and royal administrators who traveled frequently between different locations. These individuals needed to coordinate activities across different regions and time zones, making accurate portable timekeeping essential for effective administration and commerce. Diplomatic missions particularly benefited from portable clocks, as ambassadors and envoys could maintain their own schedules regardless of local timekeeping customs. Military commanders found portable timepieces valuable for coordinating troop movements and timing strategic operations. Pilgrims on long religious journeys could maintain their devotional schedules even when traveling through regions with different religious practices or time-marking traditions. The maintenance of domestic and portable clocks required specialized knowledge that was not widely available in medieval society. Unlike tower clocks, which typically had dedicated keepers responsible for their care, smaller timepieces had to be maintained by their owners or by traveling clockmakers who moved from town to town providing repair services. This created a new class of itinerant craftsmen who combined mechanical knowledge with business skills. Clock maintenance involved daily winding, periodic oiling, and occasional adjustments to the escapement timing. Owners had to learn to recognize signs of malfunction: irregular ticking, failure to keep proper time, or visible wear in the mechanism. Some problems could be addressed by careful owners, while others required the attention of skilled clockmakers who might have to travel considerable distances to reach their customers. The accuracy of medieval domestic and portable clocks was considerably poorer than their larger, more stable relatives. While a well-maintained tower clock might gain or lose only 15 minutes per day, domestic clocks might vary by an hour or more over the same period. Portable clocks, subjected to the additional stresses of travel, were even less reliable. However, for medieval users, This level of accuracy was still remarkably useful compared to the approximate timing provided by sundials or natural science. The cost of domestic and portable timepieces put them far beyond the reach of ordinary medieval people. A domestic clock might cost as much as several years' wages for a skilled craftsman, while portable timepieces commanded even higher prices due to their additional complexity and specialized construction. Ownership of a personal timepiece became a significant status symbol, comparable to owning valuable jewelry or fine artwork. As we approach the end of the medieval period, these personal timepieces began to hint at the profound changes that would characterize the Renaissance and beyond. The ability to carry time in one's pocket, to organize private life according to personal schedules, and to coordinate activities independent of community-wide time signals represented the beginning of our modern relationship with time as a personal commodity that could be managed, budgeted, and controlled by individual will. The legacy of medieval domestic and portable timepieces extends far beyond their immediate practical applications. They established the precedent for personal temporal autonomy that would eventually lead to the development of watches, chronometers, and ultimately the highly precise personal timepieces that govern our modern lives. In the quiet ticking of those first domestic clocks, we can hear the earliest whispers of the time-conscious world that was soon to emerge. As we stand at the threshold between the medieval world and the Renaissance that would follow, the gentle sound of bronze bells continues to drift across European landscapes, marking hours that have been measured and marked in ways that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. The story of medieval timekeeping draws toward its close, but its echoes will resonate through the centuries, shaping not just how we measure time, but how we understand our relationship with time itself. The transformation that had taken place over the course of the medieval centuries was nothing short of revolutionary. A world that had once lived by the fluid rhythms of sun and season, where time flowed like honey through the days and years, had gradually embraced mechanical precision, regular schedules, and shared temporal frameworks that could coordinate the activities of entire civilizations. This was not simply a matter of technological progress, it represented a fundamental shift in human consciousness, a new way of experiencing existence that would eventually touch every aspect of human society. The mechanical innovations that medieval craftsmen had developed in their patient workshops would become the foundation for all subsequent advances in timekeeping technology. The escapement mechanisms that controlled the release of energy in tower clocks would evolve into the precise regulators that govern modern chronometers. The gear trains that translated the slow movement of weights into the measured rotation of hands would inspire the intricate mechanisms of watches, navigation instruments, and eventually the electronic timing devices that surround us today. But perhaps even more significant than these technical legacies was the intellectual framework that medieval timekeeping had established. The concept of time as something that could be divided into regular, measurable units, hours, minutes, and eventually seconds represented a profound philosophical shift that would enable the scientific revolution of later centuries. The precise measurement of time intervals would become essential for experiments in physics, astronomy, and chemistry. The coordination of activities through shared time references would make possible the complex economic and social systems of the modern world. The medieval understanding of time as both practical tool and spiritual metaphor would continue to influence European culture long after mechanical clocks had become commonplace. The bells that marked the canonical hours had embedded a rhythm of prayer and reflection into the daily lives of communities across Europe. This rhythm, originally designed for monastic communities, had become so fundamental to European consciousness that it persisted even as religious observance declined and secular concerns became more prominent. The social organization that had developed around medieval timekeeping systems would provide the template for the increasingly complex societies that emerged in later centuries. The coordination of market activities through bell signals would evolve into the sophisticated commercial timing systems that made international trade possible. The legal use of time references for contracts and proceedings would develop into the precise chronological frameworks that govern modern law and business. Medieval attitudes toward time also established patterns of thought that would influence European culture for centuries to come. The idea that time could be saved or wasted, that efficiency in the use of time was a virtue, and that punctuality reflected moral character, all of these concepts had their roots in the medieval experience of living with mechanical timekeepers. The Protestant work ethic that would later become so influential in Northern Europe grew naturally from medieval practices of organizing daily life around the regular schedule of bell signals. The artistic and cultural legacy of medieval timekeeping was equally significant. The bells that had marked the hours for medieval communities became integral elements in European musical traditions. The mathematical relationships that bell founders discovered in tuning their instruments would contribute to the development of musical theory and composition. The architectural innovations required to house tower clocks would influence cathedral design and urban planning for centuries. The medieval period had also established the importance of public timekeeping as a civic responsibility. The tower clocks that had become symbols of municipal pride and prosperity set precedents for public investment in temporal infrastructure that continue to this day. Modern cities still maintain public clocks, coordinate traffic signals, and provide temporal reference points for their citizens, following patterns established by medieval communities centuries ago. The craft traditions that had developed around medieval timekeeping would continue to evolve and expand throughout the Renaissance and into the modern era. The skills required for cutting gears, calibrating escapements, and assembling complex mechanisms would transfer naturally to the production of scientific instruments, navigation devices, and eventually industrial machinery. The guild systems that had regulated clockmaking would provide models for organizing other technical professions. Perhaps most profoundly, medieval timekeeping had established the expectation that time should be accurate, reliable, and universally accessible. This expectation would drive continuous innovation and improvement in timekeeping technology, leading eventually to the atomic clocks and satellite time signals that provide the temporal foundation for our modern technological civilization. The medieval clockmaker who carefully adjusted his escapement to improve accuracy by a few minutes per day was participating in the same quest for precision that motivates modern scientists working to measure time intervals with ever greater exactness. The psychological and social changes that medieval timekeeping had initiated would continue to unfold over subsequent centuries. The experience of living according to mechanical schedules rather than natural rhythms had begun to reshape human consciousness in ways that are still evolving today. The tension between artificial time and natural time, between efficiency and organic rhythm, between public schedules and personal preference, all of these conflicts that characterize modern life had their origins in the medieval adoption of mechanical timekeeping. Educational systems that emerged in later centuries would build upon the temporal discipline that medieval communities had developed around their bells and clocks. The organization of learning into scheduled classes, the coordination of activities across different institutions, and the measurement of academic progress through timed examinations all reflected principles that had been established during the medieval period. The global expansion of European influence during the Renaissance and later periods would carry medieval timekeeping concepts to every continent. The bells that rang in medieval European towns would inspire similar systems in colonial settlements around the world. The mechanical clock technology that had been perfected in medieval workshops would eventually spread to Asia, Africa, and the Americas, carrying with it new concepts of temporal organization and social coordination. Even the environmental consciousness that characterizes much of modern thinking about time can be traced back to medieval precedents. The medieval understanding of time as cyclical, reflecting the natural rhythms of seasons and agricultural cycles, provides a counterbalance to the linear, progressive concept of time that mechanical clocks encourage. Modern movements towards sustainable living and respect for natural rhythms often draw inspiration from pre-industrial concepts of time that had their fullest expression during the medieval period. The spiritual dimensions of medieval timekeeping would continue to resonate through European culture long after their immediate religious context had diminished. The idea that time has sacred dimensions, that certain moments are particularly significant, and that the passage of time provides opportunities for reflection and growth. All of these concepts had been deeply embedded in medieval culture through the daily experience of living with bells that called communities to prayer. As we conclude our journey through the world of medieval timekeeping, we can see that the innovations and attitudes developed during those centuries continue to shape our modern relationship with time in ways both obvious and subtle. The clock on your wall, the schedule that organizes your day, the expectation that appointments will begin at specified times, the coordination of activities across different locations. All of these aspects of modern life trace their ancestry back to the patient craftsmen who created the first mechanical clocks in medieval monasteries and civic towers. The gentle sound of bronze bells that we have followed throughout this exploration continues to echo through our modern world, though we may not always recognize its voice. In the chiming of church bells on Sunday morning, the striking of courthouse clocks at the hour, and the digital signals that coordinate global communications, we can still hear echoes of those medieval innovations that first taught human communities to live according to the measured rhythm of mechanical time. The story of medieval timekeeping is ultimately a story about human ingenuity, persistence, and the endless quest to understand and organize our experience of existence itself, in creating devices that could measure time with unprecedented accuracy and reliability. Medieval craftsmen did far more than solve practical problems. They participated in the fundamental human effort to make sense of our place in the universe, to create order from chaos, and to build bridges between the temporal world we inhabit and the eternal truths we seek to understand. As you close your eyes tonight and drift towards sleep, perhaps you can imagine the sound of those medieval bells still ringing somewhere in the distance, bronze voices that once organized entire civilizations, calling across the centuries to remind us that time is both our most precious resource and our greatest mystery, something to be measured and marked, but never fully mastered or completely understood. Our journey through the world of medieval timekeeping draws to a close, but the echoes of those bronze voices continue to resonate through the centuries that separate us from their origins. We have walked through monastery courtyards where shadows mark the hours on stone sundials, climbed tower stairs where massive gear trains turned with the patience of ages, and sat beside craftsmen who shaped metal into instruments that could capture time itself. The transformation we have witnessed from the natural, fluid time of early medieval life to the measured, mechanical precision of late medieval clocks represents one of the most significant shifts in human consciousness ever recorded. It was a change that touched every aspect of medieval society, from the most intimate personal routines to the grandest civic ceremonies, from the quiet prayers of individual monks to the coordinated activities of entire kingdoms. The bells that marked this transformation were more than mere timepieces. They were the voices of communities, the heartbeat of civilizations, the bronze threads that wove individual lives into the larger tapestry of medieval society. In their patient tolling, in their regular rhythm, in their reliable presence through decades and centuries of human change, they provided something that no previous generation had ever possessed: the ability to share time, to coordinate existence, and to create temporal frameworks that could outlast any individual life. As sleep approaches and your breathing slows to match the ancient rhythms that once governed all human life, remember that the quest to understand and measure time continues still. In every clock that ticks, In every bell that chimes, in every scheduled moment of our modern lives, we participate in a tradition that began centuries ago in the stone towers and quiet workshops of medieval Europe. The craftsmen who created those first mechanical heartbeats could hardly have imagined the world their innovations would eventually create. But in their patient dedication to accuracy, their reverence for the mystery of time itself, and their commitment to serving their communities through the gifts of their craft, they established principles that continue to guide us still. Rest now, and let the gentle echo of those distant bells carry you into sleep, knowing that somewhere in the endless flow of time, the bronze voices of the past continue their ancient work of marking the hours, calling the faithful, and keeping the sacred rhythm that connects all human generations in the shared experience of temporal existence. The bells are ringing still if we know how to listen for them.